Hello, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Bretz, and today my webinar that I'm presenting on is about child support. So if you're entering your own child support order, or if you're trying to figure out what is important, what do I need to include in my child support order, what are the things I need to know, this is a good presentation for you to watch to get some more information about entering a child support order. All right, let's see if we can get this. There we go. All right, so a child support order covers the following issues: monthly child support amount, the end date for support. And what does that mean, the end date for support, right? So that means, when does child support end? Most people think when a child turns 18, it automatically ends. That's not necessarily true. Common language in a support order is when the child turns 18 or when they graduate from high school, whichever is later. This is important for some people because you may have a child that turns 18 October of their senior year, right? And so if it was just at 18, it would not cover all of that rest of the time they are still in high school. And some of you may be thinking, is this even important? Does it matter? My kid's 4 years old. Yes, it's something you have to include in your child support order, and it's part of the form that we can see here on the screen. Next thing, post-secondary support. Again, something that may not be relevant to you, especially if you have young children, but if your children are closer to the age of 16, 17, 18, might be something you want to talk about. Post-secondary support means, how are the parents going to split the cost of college? There's a lot of standard language in this, but it can be, it can be split equally between the parties, the parent and the children. There can be talk about scholarships and how those are included. There's a lot of different, very important things. It can be capped at a certain amount. So it's really important to talk to an attorney, especially if your child is close to that age, about what are the important things to include. Another thing in the child support order, who gets to claim the children on taxes? So, there's a couple different ways this can be covered, right? One of them is each parent gets to claim the children in alternating years. That means, say, if you have 2 children, odd years, dad gets to claim the children on his taxes, even years, mom gets to claim the children on the taxes. Another way to do this is, if you have, say, 2 children, mom gets to claim one child every single year, dad gets to claim the other child every single year. So it really depends. Maybe one parent has significantly more time than the other parent. So maybe there is a basis for them claiming the children or the child every year. A lot of different kind of factors can go into that. Medical coverage is part of the child support order. So who is paying the premiums? Who is covering the children? Is that factored into the child support payment? Uninsured medical, that's another important piece. How is that? Is that allocated 50-50? Is that allocated proportionately? That is also with shared expenses. So we'll talk about those a little bit more, but that's kind of the overview. So how is monthly child support calculated? Great question. To calculate your child support, you first need to determine your gross monthly income, as well as other potential income sources, right? So when we're looking at gross monthly income, this could just mean salary. It could also include wages, deferred compensation, overtime, income from any secondary job, trust income, severance pay, annuities, capital gains, pension benefits, social security benefits, rent, royalties. That's most of them, but if you have a partner who gets some kind of, maybe what we would call unique income or not standard income, you want to look at the RCW to make sure that all of the potential ways that they are receiving money is included in the calculation for child support. Income that needs to be disclosed either, to your partner if you're going to an agreement or to the court, but is not included for the purposes of income for child support, includes income from another partner in a household, child support received from other relationships, gifts, prizes, and any state support. So a lot of the times, right, we have parents say, well, me and my partner have been separated for a while. I have a new girlfriend. She lives in the house with me. Her income should not be included. This is something you have to inform the court about. That doesn't mean the court's going to use that amount to calculate your support, but it will be used as knowledge in the overall decision, in consideration of what is a need or what you have the ability to give. This also includes child support from other relationships, right? So if you have two children, each from a different partner, and you're receiving a significant amount of support from one partner, again, this is not going to be calculated to determine your support for the other parent, but it will be considered in your overall need for support. Imputed income. This is something very important and can be sometimes confusing for parents. So when should you be using imputed income, or when is the court going to impute a parent's income? So the law states that the court shall impute an income to a parent when the parent is voluntarily unemployed or voluntarily underemployed. So let's kind of define those terms better. Voluntarily unemployed means a parent has the ability to work, or can work, has the background, has the history, has the education, but is choosing not to. So the court's going to give them income for the purposes of child support. This voluntarily unemployed can become a little bit complicated, right? Because another parent can argue that they're not able to get work, or they're injured, or there's things preventing them from work, right? But so that's kind of an argument potentially with the court. Voluntarily underemployed means maybe the parent is only working 20 hours a week, but they have the ability to work more, but they're choosing not to. Or maybe the parent is working at a job that pays a lot less than they could potentially be earning. And that is based on evidence, right? That's based on history of work. That's based on, again, their education or their ability to obtain a different job. So those are places where, say parent one is working 20 hours a week, earning minimum wage, and their income is very low. The court can, at their option, impute a higher income to the parent for purposes of child support, if they meet some of these factors. Again, as an overview, the court shall determine whether the parent is voluntarily underemployed or unemployed based on the parent's assets, residence, employment, earning history, job skills, educational attainment, literacy, health, age, criminal record, dependency court obligations, other employment barriers, records of seeking work, local job market, other relevant factors. So this is a very all-encompassing thing. And if, say, you are in the opposite position, and you have been trying to obtain a job, and it's been very difficult, and your education, maybe you have some education, but it's not allowing you to get an applicable position, those are all things that you can present to the court for the purposes of your income, right? But it's important to make sure that you're tracking those things. You're tracking your job-seeking efforts to provide to the court. Additionally, a court shall not impute income to a parent who is gainfully employed on a full-time basis. So if a parent is working full-time, maybe their income is a little bit lower, the court should not impute them unless there is evidence that the parent is voluntarily underemployed purposely to reduce their child support obligation. So if there can be evidence presented of that, the court then can impute their income. Another kind of thing about how monthly child support is calculated, let's see if we can kind of look at this worksheet here, right? So when we're running a worksheet for a parent and we're doing a child support order, there is a calculation to how this is imputed. So we see here on this first line, gross monthly income, one parent is going to be on column one parent is going to be on column two. You're going to have your wages and salaries, and then here's some of the other options for income, right? Business income, maintenance received, that could be spousal support, right? That has to be included. And then we have a line for imputed income. So it's, we have maybe their regular income on line 1A, and then maybe their imputed income on line 1F. Then we have monthly deductions. And a very important thing to note here is that a lot of this can be done through like a standard tax calculation. Another way to do this is to take your pay stubs, take your taxes for the year, divide them by 12, put them in there, right? Because sometimes a typical income tax calculator may not be calculating exactly what's getting taken out of your paycheck, right? Some people have higher deductions, some people have lower. So it's often more accurate to kind of take your pay stubs and use those. Other, important things to note here, right? Some people have mandatory union pensions or professional dues. Those are included, but only if you have them, right? Not everyone does. Also voluntary or retirement contributions. So, a lot of times parents are contributing significant amounts to their retirement per month. However, it is important to note that you can only deduct $416 per month for your voluntary retirement contribution. So even if you're a parent who's contributing $2,000 per month to your 401k, that cannot be deducted for the purposes of child support. You can only deduct $416 per month. It's a yearly cap on your deduction for the purposes of child support. So that's a good thing to note. So post-secondary support, let's get into a little bit more detail about this. One thing is, so we talked about earlier, right? If you have younger children, this is really not going to be relevant for you, but it is something you can reserve in your child support order so that you can address at a future date, right? Especially oftentimes we are entering child support orders for parents with children who are 4 or 6 years old, right? This question of post-secondary support is not going to come for another 15 years. So it's something you can reserve. And when you reserve it, that means it can be addressed at a future date. Oftentimes too, even if you have a child who's say 12, 13, 14, maybe that's not something you're ready yet to address, but it does need to be addressed before they reach the end date of support, right? So your child is a couple months away from graduating, and that's their end date of support, right? So you need to, there needs to be some urgency in getting post-secondary support figured out. One of the things that I often see becoming an issue in post-secondary support sections is, does your child have a college tuition savings fund? If so, how will that be allocated, right? Is one parent in charge of that? If so, does that go to that parent's portion, or is that the child's portion, right? So that's something you want to think about and something you definitely want to write into your order. Also, you want to make sure you're considering not just tuition, but all college expenses. So this is books, room and board, food plan. Maybe your child's going to college out of state. Is there going to be, are the parents sharing costs for travel when the child wants to come home for the holidays? Are the children playing sports? Are there sports fees associated with that? So a lot of really important things to think about here. we do, this is a thing we do often, and we have a lot of very strong clauses and terms that we would use. But this can be a very important section because, as many of us know, college can become very expensive. It looks like we're missing a title here, but this is about taxes, right? Claiming children on taxes. Talked about this a little in the beginning. But it can either be an alternate, right? Every parent claims the children 1 year and then the other. There can be a child, each parent has a specific child or a couple of children that they claim every year. Or again, if one parent has significant time with the children, they can request that they claim them every year. So this is just an important thing to make sure that is included. And, either agreed upon or requested from the court. Medical coverage. So this is another thing that's included in your child support order, right? And this is also, we looked at the worksheet earlier. This is a cost that is included on the worksheet. So you want to make sure that you are very specific about this. So the first bullet here, the amount you pay to cover the children on your health insurance can be deducted from your child support payment. So oftentimes the issue I see sometimes with parents is they say, I work at this place, this is my monthly cost for medical coverage. And that includes me and the children. So remember, when you are putting this cost here, you have to designate the cost that it takes just to cover the children and not including yourself. So that's something you can often ask your insurance for to break down for you, but you want to be specific about the coverage for the children and not for everyone. This can also be a pretty important thing to know in your child support order, especially if one parent has more time with the children, if one parent is taking the children to medical appointments more often, right? Being able to access that coverage, being able to get reimbursement for those costs, right? So say, we have one parent who is the one who is taking the children to medical appointments more often because maybe they have more time with the children. And they're having to pay out of pocket and then get reimbursed by the other parent for the insurance, and it becomes complicated. So sometimes it is really just what is most practical, right? To have the children covering the parents. Then the question was, should we double cover the children, right? Should both parents have the children on their insurance because it protects them better? Another thing is, who has better insurance, right? Sometimes, maybe one parent's insurance coverage for the children is really, really high and expensive, but it's really good, and maybe that makes sense. Or maybe another parent just has significantly better coverage. So those are all things to think about, and it can be important, especially if, again, you have young children. This plan is maybe going to be in place for a while. These are important things you want to think about. How do I make sure I get paid back for uninsured medical expenses? Great question. Typically, when we do child support orders, we make sure we include language about reimbursement under the medical coverage or uninsured medical section, right? So we typically include language that is something along the lines of each party must receive proper documentation of the expense before reimbursement. Proof of expense shall be provided, and within 14 days of receipt, it will be paid back. And then, if there's high conflict, right, you can add language such as, if there's a disagreement about applicable expenses or reimbursement of payment, the parties will submit to arbitration. That's really if you have a history of extreme conflict over reimbursement, right? Sometimes we see parents that they take their kids to the doctor. They use insurance. They still have $50 out of pocket. They ask the other parent for their cost or, their portion of that expense, and the parent never pays them back. Maybe their portion is 50%, $25 in the grand scheme of things maybe isn't a lot, but when that begins to add up and it becomes over and over and over again, one parent is covering a significant cost, and that can become very difficult. So you want to make sure you have very specific language in the child support order to think about that and cover those in case those situations occur. Other shared expenses. So this is a really important section of the child support order that sometimes I think people neglect or feel sometimes that it's not as important, but I think especially when your kids are older, especially when your kids are completing a lot of sports, extracurriculars, all of those things, this is a very important section. So it depends on what you're asking the court or what you can agree with the other party. But some typical other shared expenses include extracurriculars, school-related expenses, camps. Those are, some of the typical ones I see, right? So extracurriculars, there's different ways you can do this, right? Sometimes in shared expenses, you can specify that it's only agreed upon extracurriculars. Then one parent can't sign another child up for 15 extracurriculars and ask you to pay for them. This all, again, depends on the relationship you and the other parent have, and the ability you have to communicate and work through conflict and those kind of things, right? Another way you can do it is, if you're entering a child support for maybe a little bit of an older child, you can use the language such as historical extracurriculars, right? So that means extracurriculars a child has already participated in. So if you have a child who is doing select soccer and select swimming, right, or swim team or something of that nature, those are expenses that are going to continue to be shared by the parties. If the other parent then wants to sign them up for 5 new extracurriculars, right, like those are not going to be shared expenses. So this becomes very important language because sports, again, can be very expensive, especially if we're doing travel, especially if we're doing select. We have, all of those costs that are associated with that. School-related expenses, these, again, can be important as well, especially when you're getting an older child. Maybe the child has books they have to pay for, things of that nature that can become expensive, especially if they're in, AP classes or, kind of, they have, those expenses can become high for one parent to cover on their own. Typically, this does not include school lunches. I have had conflict over this issue before, and school lunches is typically a thing that a parent on their time has to cover, right? So if one parent is putting money on the children's school lunch book, and the child uses it during the other parent's time because the other parent is not making them lunch or providing them with a lunch, that becomes a difficult thing to reimburse unless there is very specific language about it. Another thing, camps. Some families have their children participate in a lot of summer camps. Again, an expensive thing. So think about that language, either historical camps they have participated in or agreed upon camps. Or if you know that you have a good working relationship with the other parent, and you both want you want your child to participate in camps, that can just be, summer camps. Even more important, how are these typically split? 50-50 or proportionately? So a lot of times these are split proportionately. And what does that mean? So if on the worksheet, once the calculations have been made in terms of your income, it's going to spit you out a percentage, right? And the percentage is your incomes combined and the individual percentage of each. So if we have one parent making $2,000 a month and one making $5,000 a month, we're going to have, a 70-20, 70-30 percentage, something around there, right? If the parents are making completely equal incomes, it's going to be split 50-50. But this is very important if you have one parent who makes significantly more than the other parent. It makes more sense for the cost to be split proportionately because the parent who is making significantly more has the ability to better afford those things, right? And so proportionally makes sense. And then we have the language here about historical or agreed upon. There we go. So that is most of what you're going to want to pay attention to on the child support order. And I think child support orders are very important. They can stay in place for a long time, and obviously they can be changed if there is a change in circumstances. But they are very important aspects of either your divorce or your parentage matter. So it's very important to make sure the language and the structure is there, because sometimes even if you have, one parent required to do something to, pay for shared expenses or, split medical costs, but there is no kind of language that specifies when that will be paid or how long they have, or if there's receipts required or anything of that nature, it become high conflict and you're dragged back into court to enforce this payment, and that becomes very frustrating and very difficult. So if you are trying to figure out, some better language for your child support order, or if you have a child support order that you're trying to change, please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for listening.